What is up, car and tech fans? Welcome back to another garage tinkering video. This one, I'm afraid to say, is going to be a little bit different to what we used to because it's going to be a bit scathing, I'm afraid. I've had a weird week with the progress on the gauges for my 350Z, with actually a mix of real highs of getting some stuff done that people said couldn't be done, and then basically most of the week of crippling lows and frustration brought about by issues, big issues with LVGL9. But let's start on a high point and what I thought was a really good bit of progress. See, throughout this build, I've been using these ST7701 screens. They're an RGB screen, so they get their data through lots of individual RGB pins, and they use an SPI setup just to do all the initialization and, handling all the data connections. And they plug into these boards that I've got, which are a WaveShare LCD display driver that runs them off a 40-pin connection and has an ESP-S3 on it. And officially, according to the documentation that comes with it, in order to get all of this working, you need to have this quite complex porting document to allow LVGL to run on these boards due to the way the buffer handlings are done and redraws and all this kind of stuff. And I was searching forever to try and find a solution to upgrade them from LVGL 8, which is what I'm currently using, to the new LVGL 9. Because a lot of you have been saying, hey, gauges that were a component in LVGL 8 have now been depreciated and replaced by scales. Maybe you should look at doing it in that instead. So I've been really wanting to get these boards upgraded to LVGL 9. But everywhere I looked was like, it either can't be done or the porting document hasn't been written by anybody yet, so there's nothing, no resources for you to go out and find how to do it. If you want to do it, you're going to have to write all the porting documents yourself, and that. But I was working on something else for a different video, and I have these other displays, which are these 2.1-inch touch screens. They're another WaveShare board. And they have everything integrated. So as well as having the ESP32S3 on here, we've got RTCs, we've got gyroscopes, we've got, just a bunch of other additional stuff. When I was building something for these displays, when I realized the documentation that came with them mentions that these screens are also an ST7701. And as far as I was aware, you could get LVGL9 on these displays. I'm sure I remember doing it. So it made me think, what would happen if I unplugged the screen from one of these and plugged my screen in? Would it work? And the answer is yes. It does exactly what it needs to do. So long as you remove the touch elements from the initialization code, because if you've still got the touch elements in there, it tries to set them all up through SPI and they're not there, and it returns that they're not there, and then the code freaks out. But so long as you remove those bits, the entire thing initializes. You can run these screens on this board, which is great because I need to make some custom PCBs anyway, which are basically a smaller version of this, and just hold all the components in a circular PCB that will sit behind these smaller 2.1-inch screens. And that means I could use these as the basis. They come with a schematic diagram that I can reverse engineer in order to make a board that works exactly the same way. And I also noticed that the documentation did the porting very differently. It doesn't have a lot of the things in there which were causing real slowdown and tearing and loads of issues on the board. So I managed to get LVGL 8 running on these screens perfectly well. So I decided to start off the week by getting these things ported to LVGL 9, no matter what it took. And to be honest, it actually wasn't that difficult. We have a new LVGL driver documentation, and in here in this CPP file is where we do that porting, and all we had to do was set up the buffers in a different format, and then the flush display was basically able to work basically the same. This is the bit of code that says take whatever LVGL is showing on the screen and send it to your graphics driver, whichever one you're using. This is using TFT ESPI. And then just change the way that this initialization works. And it's really, really simple. We just basically have to set up a display with the creating it with the height and width, set the buffers, which are these two at the top. At the moment, it's using triple buffering, which means there's the screen, obviously, at any one point in time, and then it buffers the next screen to replace it with. And whilst it's buffering that next screen, it's also getting a third one ready. So it's like it has three. So it should, in theory, allow faster redraws, which mean that the redraws are smoother. It's not necessarily working out that way in practice, but we'll get to that in a minute. And then just a couple of setups. Now, this was all easy, and the documentation for this, provided by LVGL for setting up LVGL 9 porting, was good, and it worked. And there was, a few hiccups here and there, but for the most part, it was decent. And I'm afraid to say, that's where the end of the documentation for LVGL 9 being good ends. Because after that, it was bad. Bad, yeah, that's the word I'm going to stick with. For 95% of people who are using a component library like this, the first point of entry that they're going to have to it is going to be the documentation. You're going to go onto examples. It's going to say, hey, grab this little bit of code, put it on your screen, and it'll do it. And then you can learn to tweak it from there. That's how people learn. If you get your code from the documentation and you put it in and it goes, yeah, no, sorry, mate, those functions you've asked for, they don't exist. You're like, what? I've just got it from the documentation. And then you go deeper into the API documentation. It's like, oh, no, that function that's in the example, it doesn't exist. What are you on about? It just leaves a bitter taste. So let's take a look at kind of like a comparison between doing things in 8 and doing things in 9, and I'll show you what I mean. First, let's do a benchmark and see how 8 versus 9 is benchmarked across two like identical setups. And so to kick things off, we have two identical boards. Like I say, these are these WaveShare 2.8-inch touchscreen boards, but they're attached to these two identical screens. So the only thing that's going to be different between the two is this one is running LVGL 8, this one is running LVGL 9. And I've just put the performance and the memory monitors on so we can just take a look at those as we go. Also, they're both just using a single buffer for the redraws, plus I'd set the refresh period in the LV file down to 10 milliseconds, which should give us a really high FPS. And in this example, we can see just a black screen. It's just sitting at a constant 100 FPS at 2 or 3% CPU on LVGL 8, and on LVGL 9, this is a tiny bit lower, 96, but at 4% FPS. So this one's doing worse on just the black screen, but that's not really much of a comparison. We're going to approach this like an absolute beginner would. We're going to go into the documentation for version 8, grab an example, put it on the version 8 board, grab an example for version 9, put it on the version 9 board, and just see where things start to fall apart. So I'll do a first benchmark by putting an out-of-the-box basic spinner on the screen that just sits and spins, and we'll make it full size of the screen because that'll test like full screen redraws. This is the documentation for LVGL 8. Here's an example of a simple spinner. So all I want to do in this instance is grab the code, come into my setup. So this is my setup for LVGL 8. I've got the black screen attached, and then I'm going to add a spinner on here, and it adds it to the active screen. So I shouldn't need to do anything other than change the size. And I say we're going to make it roughly full size, so 460 by 460. And we'll just upload that one onto the board. Unfortunately, I have to do one and then flip my LVGL version and then do the other. So it's a lot of like cross installation. It's not usually a thing you would have to do, but it's a bit of a pain for this. See that over there spinning away. So I am going to then get rid of this one, bring in my one for version 9, and then we'll do LVGL 9 spinner. Here we go. So master. So this one, if we just look at the left, is for the master, whereas this one is for version 8. So this is the latest one. Grab the C code for spinner. See, it's slightly different. So you activate it, you set its size, and then the animation properties are now taken out of the initialization. So it's slightly different, but again, not really too big of an issue. 460 by 460, and we'll just make it the same time as the other one was, because the other one was 1 second and then 0.2 delay. So here they are, both spinning away. LVGL 8 is sat at a constant 100 FPS with 39-40% CPU usage. RAM is at 4.4 kilobytes, 4%, whereas this one is 75 frames a second at 59-60% CPU, and still only 6% of the memory use. So 9 is giving us 25 fewer frames a second, and it's taking 15 to 20% more CPU to do it. And you can see as the tail end of this spinner comes around, you can see it gets choppy at the top. It's like bup, 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 bup. Whereas this size, it's just smooth. Then we'll take a different example closer to what we've been doing with these gauges. And on the meter page, we've got, again, the documentation and some examples. Let's go for this one. This is similar to the kind of thing that we've been creating. And again, I'm not going to worry too much about reading what it is. I'm a beginner, so I don't know. But we'll just put the initializer and the callback into there. And then I'm just going to grab the meter itself, take all that code and just replace the spinner. And that should all just work. Should. So we have a compile issue. Even LVGL8 isn't perfect. The compile issue is saying there's an invalid conversion from void to LV indicator type. Yes, so it's got a void here. This is expecting an indicator type, so we just need to cast it. You know, that's an easy fix. But someone just coming in and learning this for the first time would see that, and they would have no concept that that was the solution. And that it's as simple as that. And you would just be put off from ever, using this thing. You would just be like, oh, well, it doesn't work. If the examples don't work, it doesn't work. Let's just check that out. But, after that one fix, it is ticking away nicely. It looks like the example. It's nice and smooth. It's doing what I expect. So it's ticking along and doing all that redrawing. So that one casting issue aside, it works. Let's do the same with 9. So in the 9 documentation, we know it's called a scale. Where's an example that's similar? Let's have a look. Examples. Okay, this is pretty close. So let's take this left-hand side one. So we're only going to need some of these, like needle line. We don't need anything to do with the image. This is just showing that you can assign an image here. So we'll put some of this code in. So we need the needle line global element. We need the callback function for it. Again, is that going to need casting? We'll find out. And then a simple round scale. So we just need the first one. And it's that bit. That's like half of it. Again, we'll just replace the spinner, pop that in, and should be good to go. There might be that casting issue again, but we'll see. Similar problem. But this time it's removed that special case. In the LVGL8, indicators have their own special type. Now they're just all object types. Right, and there we go. We have another problem. Set reverse duration wasn't declared in this scope. Do you mean set playback duration? So we would go, okay, well, we don't know what this is. Let's have a little look. So reverse time API, we're not using time, we're using duration. Will be removed soon, use duration instead. So if we look for duration, it says in the documentation here for LVGL master at latest, make it go back to the start. So if that's not the code, what is? Now, this is recommended, is it playback duration? So maybe, I don't know, let's try it. Well, it's uploading. What have we got? Let's have a look. Okay, well, at least with that, it is displaying it and it is doing what it looks like it should do. And for comparison, we're seeing between 55 and 70% CPU, so, you know, roughly the same, and 55, 60 FPS, which again is roughly the same. So these are running pretty comparably. Like this one is smaller. Typically smaller things require a little bit less processing. So just for comparison's sake, let's put this one over in the middle and make it a little bit larger. So they're the same size. So we're up and running on here, and the FPS is it's down a little bit. So from 30 at its lowest up to 49 at its highest, whereas this one is closer to like upper 50s. And the CPU is running here 64 up to 78%, whereas over here we're 53 to 70. So this one's up to 80 now on this one. So this one is definitely running hotter, as it were, and we're getting ever so slightly less FPS, but it's negligible. It's pretty comparable. But then here's a use case, right? This was something I was trying to do yesterday, and it took me literally hours, and I got nowhere. So I'm going to start again with LVGL 8. So all I want to do is take the little numerical labels around the outside and move them in a little bit. This is just a very specific use case because it was something I was trying to achieve yesterday. So if we bring up the documentation for here, probably something to do with the label. So we could just search for label. What have we got? So tick is the tick lines, add a scale. That's adding the scales. Tick color, label gap. So there's what we're after, is label gap, where we're doing the set the major ticks. So set major ticks is here, right in front of us. And the label gap is the, which one? The very last one. So this one is the gap. So it's currently 10. So if I made that 40, that should shift everything in by 30 pixels. Let's just make sure it does that first. Okay, it looks pretty clustered, but they are there. They've now all moved in 30, so they're all bunched in the middle. But it's done what we wanted. So that's what we're looking for now, label gap. So how do we do that on the second one? Label gap doesn't exist. Okay. So maybe it's called something else. Label. What do we have to do with labels? Scale. No. Rotation of the major tick labels, directional rotation. No. Rotated by fixed amount, or they can be fixed relative to something else. No. They might be upside down. No, it's not that. This is possible to offset the radial labels from the major ticks. Perfect. This is what we want. LV set pad radial on the scale by amount to the part indicator. Great. There's no way that's a lie, is there? Then we'll add that in. So we've got the scale initialization here. That'll do. So object, set the pad of the radius to the scale, set it in, another 30 to the part indicator. Groovy. I don't know if you can tell what's coming now, but that was a lie. Scale was not declared. Okay, that bit was my fault, scale not being declared in the scope, but set pad style radial was not declared in this scope because that doesn't exist in LVGL 9. That thing in the documentation is wrong. That doesn't exist. So, did you mean style pad all? Maybe. Let's try that. Maybe that'll do what we want. But it has not done anything. It's not moved those inwards. So that bit of code is not the one. So what is it? What's the code to pull that little bit of label in? And if we search for this, there's like nothing on it. There's the LVG documentation. There's the styles doc, which if we look in here, it doesn't exist actually in there. So yeah, and then we go into here and it's not in there anymore. So it's like, what else is there? There's other pads. So we've got pads for all, horizontal, vertical. Pad gap, maybe that one. I don't know, probably not. Pad gap, let's try that. Long story short, I spent literally hours yesterday trying to find how to move those labels in on the scale, because I reproduced most of my gauge in LVGL 9. There were a lot of things like this that made it really difficult along the way. And I'm someone who's been using component libraries and developing for a long time. And I found it really, really frustrating to constantly be told by the official documentation, this is how you do something, doing it, and it being a liar.
He's a liar.
It got to the point I was asking on my Discord, does anybody know how to do this? No one knew. No one could figure it out. I still don't know what the answer is. And because I can't move them, the labels with the new font that I put on the screen overlap the arc around the outside. So it's just not usable. I can't move past that point. And there were just lots of those frustrations. I couldn't get a simple image to load onto the screen for the splash, because for some reason, when I convert an image using the official image converter and put that in using all the official documentation, the images just don't show up. It works perfectly fine with the conversion and doing the documentation from 8, but with 9, it just doesn't work. So I got to the point where I had this jubilation early in the week where I'd got this new porting working, and it's working so much better and so much smoother than it was before. And I was able to upgrade to LVGL 9, which meant great. I could use the most up-to-date and the most feature-rich version of this component library, and it's the one that everybody's really going to want to use. And it just doesn't work. And it's really frustrating. And someone in my Discord said, why don't you use the Squareline Studio, a UI builder, and see how you do it in there? I was like, yeah, it's a great idea. So I boot up the builder to take a look at it, and guess what? They're not in here. They don't exist. They're not part of it. So you can't, meters and scales aren't in the builder. So how you use this to build gauges for cars, you can't. If you're not using scales and meters, you can't do it. It's just been really frustrating. And I wanted so much to use this newest version and be able to walk you all through how we can do things on the newest, most, up-to-date version of LVGL. But personally, I think at this point in time, it is not ready for practical use. It's just not there. There's too much of it that is either incorrectly documented, doesn't work, things that can't be done that were available to be done in 8. When you're building a component library that you're making more and more feature rich, you need to add features, but not rug pull the things that people were already doing in a previous version and just not make them doable. I'm sure there must be a way of moving these little labels in by 30 pixels, but I've no idea how to do it. And it's really, really frustrating. So I'm now left with a quandary. And maybe you guys can help me figure out the path forwards for this. But despite the frustrations, this isn't going to get me down. I've let it all out now in this video. It's time to move forwards. And I have a couple of different options. The whole reason I wanted to do this new porting and new upgrading is because on the version 8 gauges that I had, the sweep on the gauge was a little bit janky, and it was because of the porting and because of some of the stuff to do with the double buffering and the setup, and it was going down to 5 or 6 frames a second. Didn't look fantastic. Now, I've solved a lot of that with this new porting solution, but it's still not great. And I think that's just a product of meters and how meters work. When you've got them full screen, because of all the ticks and everything, it doesn't just redraw the line, it redraws the entire meter. So it's very, very system intensive, which means you get a much lower FPS when you're trying to run those full screen things. So that was my rationale for doing all of this, was to try and improve that FPS and get a smoother transition in the line by actually getting proper partial screen draws. And I have made it a bit better, but it's still not great. So I have a number of options going forwards, and I don't know which one to do. So I would love to hear your opinions. So we have option 1. I put up with it. I don't like this option. Is I put it with it. It's fine. It'll, be all right for now. And I move forwards and I get the next stage done and get the custom PCBs done and the custom enclosures and all that stuff. And I mount it in the car and move on with my life. The difficulty with that is that I then do need to flow this down to the big gauges in front of me. And if I have that, low frames per second and tearing and all that kind of stuff on the big screens right in front of me, that is going to be annoying. So, I don't feel great about not solving it before moving on. Option 2, I persist through the frustration of LVGL 9 and try and figure out how to fix some of these things. You know what? I don't even know if it's possible right now. There's some things I'm trying to do that I don't know if it's, capable of doing, because the documentation literally isn't in place to tell me if it can do it or how to do it. So yeah, option 2 is persist and try to port it all over to LVGL 9 properly. Option 3 is change the design slightly. We know that the point of failure of these is meters in LVGL 8. It's probably why they're like extra components and not a core component. It takes a lot of processing power to do the full screen redraws. And I think if I was to use something back like I did in version 1 when we used the ARC, but in a more minimal aesthetic way, we could massively reduce the CPU usage. We can massively increase the FPS. We could animate it now that we've got proper porting and everything going on, and it would all look a lot smoother and crisper, but the UI would have to change. So that's option 3. And then option 4, question mark profit, or just question mark. What do you think? Is there another option? Do I have another path forwards here that I haven't seen? Maybe try a completely different component library. I don't know. It seems I'm quite far down the rabbit hole now. This thing has been out of my car for months and I can't really drive the car without center console. And I really want to get back in and drive my car. So I'm trying not to do the thing that's going to take forever. So they're my options. I don't know. I'm at a kind of a crossroads. I'm not sure what is the best path forward. So please let me know what you think is the best path forward. What would you like to see? Would you like to see me try and figure all this stuff out in LVGL 9? Or would you prefer to see a new UI that is a bit slicker and a bit more, I don't know, modern and minimal? What would rev your engine, I guess? And again, I just need to reiterate, I do love using LVGL. This wasn't a glowing recommendation for it, I'll admit. But I think 8 is in a really good shape if you take away the performance lacking of meters. I think a lot of it otherwise works really, really nicely. It's just a pain that the latest and greatest version, it's just the documentation is just so out, and it's just, you can't rely on it. And if you can't rely on the official documentation to tell you what to do, then where do you get your information? So yeah, if you do work at LVGL, I implore you, spend some time and get this fixed, because who knows how many people you're losing off the back of it. But otherwise, I do, like I say, I do love using it. And I will continue, I expect, to use it for these and the rest of the gauges going forwards. But is it going to be 9? Is it going to be 8? Who knows? And if you know how to move those labels in, please tell me, because that could make the decision much easier, but I haven't found it yet. I know that this video was probably not as educational and useful as they tend to be, but it was born out of a necessity to highlight why we're going to do what we're going to do going forwards. We'll be back next week with actually some really cool stuff on reverse engineering PCBs and how you can take these boards and reverse engineer them and build custom ones for your own use. I think it's a lot more useful than 30 minutes of me sat and complaining. But that 30 minutes of me complaining is me getting out 5 days of literal frustration. Like, I haven't been able to make any progress this week because this has just roadblocked me. And that's why we're here making this video instead of showing the awesome finished result, because I haven't been able to get there. Hopefully, that's as much of me losing my cool that you're ever going to see. I don't like to do it. I like to be level-headed and just chill. But this needed to come out today. Anyway, I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments. And whatever you do with the rest of your day, folks, have a wicked one. I'll see you next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Take it easy, peeps. Bye-bye.